Is there any yes, Joe?
Oh, all set.
All set. Okay. Any disclosures of conflict of interest? None. That'll be noted. Okay, so we have is there any yes, Joe?
Oh, all set.
All set. Okay. Any disclosures of conflict of interest? How come I just had that as feedback? Okay, that's all better. Okay, we have development charge background study. Mr. Langlois. Hey, Dale.
Hello, good evening, Your Worship, members of council. So we've been working on this here development charge background study since March. We've hired Watson and Associates as our consultants for the project. You can see as you can see, I've created a report for this meeting, but Watson is going to cover everything and then some, everything that's in the report. So I'm not going to talk too much right now, but we'll make ourselves available for questions after the presentation. And yeah, just before we get started, there was a lot of work that went into this over the months. And I just want to thank Peter Mara and Larry Solani. There's a lot of work put in by everyone in this, and then also thanks to Watson. So I'm going to turn it over to Daryl Abbs, and then we'll be happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation.
Welcome, Daryl.
Hi, thank you for having me. I know Gary Scanlon is supposed to be logging on. He might be having trouble with the Zoom, because I know we don't typically use Zoom, so let me just double check. I mean, I can get started if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. So apologies, I know everyone's kind of living in this technological world and trying to log in and having problems and people running in. So I appreciate your patience. So I can share the presentation. I just want to double check. Sorry, I jumped on late. Was the public meeting officially opened?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. Okay, so can everybody see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So just a little introduction for myself. So my name is Daryl Abbs. I'm a senior project coordinator with Watson Associates. And so we've been hired, retained by the town to assist with the preparation of the development charge background study and the associated bylaw. So today we're going to go through the public meeting presentation. We'll go through the presentation. We'll start off with a D.C. overview, kind of discussion about what DCs are and how they're calculated. Then we'll move into the discussion and presentation of the proposed policies and charges that we've prepared and worked on with town staff. And then we can open it up, and the order is up to you, but if there's any presentations from the public, and then if there's questions from council have a chance to ask questions and discuss. And then we'll conclude the public meeting and formally close the public meeting. So as I mentioned, so the purpose of this public meeting is to kind of go over the proposed development charge policies and the rates that we've calculated and worked on with town staff. This is a mandatory meeting under the Development Charges Act. So prior to council's consideration of the bylaw, we have to have the background study released a minimum of 60 days prior to that. So first consideration of the bylaw, 2 months before that, we have to release the study, make it public, and put it on the town's website. So we've released the study to meet those timelines. And so just an overview of the study process. So we began the process back in March, kind of the early 2020. We worked with staff to develop the growth forecast, review the policies, have detailed staff meetings to go over the capital needs and refine the analysis. We released the background study to the public on October 7th. Tonight, we're having the mandatory public meeting on the 29th of October, and council's consideration of the bylaw is scheduled for December 8th.
Daryl, if I can just interrupt, Gary Scanlon is now online, just to let you know. I'm not sure if you see him on your screen, but he is now online.
Oh, I did not. I can pass it over to Gary. He's, if he's on, if you want to take over, Gary?
Not a problem. I do apologize. For some reason, I just could not log in. So the internet gods were working against me tonight, so I do apologize. So you've proceeded to the first couple of slides, I'm assuming then?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I think Daryl's just gone through to describe the process that we've gone through. And obviously we've reached a point to release the background study. Once we release the background study, the Development Charges Act requires a minimum 60-day circulation before council could consider adoption of the bylaw. So you can see we've released it on the 7th of October. We're considering adoption on December 8th. So we've met that minimum 60-day time horizon. Next slide, please, Daryl. Development charges, they're not new. They've been around for 65 years now. They were originally under the Planning Act, but in 1989, they were formalized under a piece of legislation called the Development Charges Act. With that, the basis for development charges is to recover growth-related capital, growth-related infrastructure, which will service both new residential and new non-residential growth. The second bullet is just points out that the act is structured in a way where it says very localized costs are the responsibilities of the developing landowner. So with the subdivision, you probably have internal roads, water mains, sewers, street lights, sidewalks, etc. And they're categorized as local services. And they're basically the responsibility of the developer. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about local service later because we are compelled to have a definition of what that is. And if you look at Appendix E in your report, you'll see that we've got a local service policy. So the localized services are the developer's responsibility. The broader services that are outside of the subdivision basically are what we include in the development charge calculation. So there's two different categories, and the DC is basically taking that broader cost. Next slide, please. We've gone through some changes in the act lately. The province started a process about a year and a half ago, and they really completed that. And there are some changes which I'll touch upon tonight. One of the changes is that they've modified the eligible services that municipalities can collect, and we've listed them here. So for the most part, they're probably the most direct costs that you'd anticipate development will have an impact on: water, wastewater, storm, services related to a highway as roads. We have transit, waste diversion, etc. So these are the key ones that the Act now says that we can collect direction. But in your particular case, you're not significantly impacted by these changes. Next slide. The calculations are at a very high level. There's actually a lot of rules, regulations, and 150 MB cases that help define the legislation. But in very simple terms, we start by identifying the amount, type, and location of growth, identifying the services needed to accommodate that growth. Those services are obviously related to capital infrastructure. We deduct any grant subsidies or the contributions that are anticipated. These days with grants and subsidies, there aren't a significant amount. We need to consider if these assets benefit existing development. So for the most part, benefit to existing really is in areas where, let's say I'm going to knock down a 5,000 square foot fire station and build a brand new 10,000 square foot. The first 5,000 square feet is replacement. So that would be considered a benefit to the existing. The expansion is what we would consider for DC purposes. So there's other measures, but basically if you're overcoming an inherent problem within an area, such as for water, you've got low pressure, or with wastewater, you've got backups in sewers and such. Those are things that the new infrastructure would be hopefully resolving, and they would be a deduction. There was a mandatory 10% deduction. So your existing bylaw today, if you look back at the study before, it required for the softer services that when you get to all the deductions, it basically said deduct an extra 10%. That was the province's requirement for the municipalities to make a contribution towards services. That now has been removed with the recent legislation. We also had requirements to undertake 10-year service standard calculations. So we look backwards, the last 10 years, we do quality, quantity calculations. And basically what they do is they set a ceiling on what we can collect from development into the future. We've provided that once again. So if you look at Appendix B in the report, we've done all of the measures as required by the Act. And then the last adjustment is when we move from one bylaw to the next, if there's reserve fund balances, then we need to consider the impacts of that in the calculations. So then left with a net capital cost, which we must allocate between a residential and non-residential benefit. And then basically divide it back by the growth. And in doing so, we calculate a low, medium, high density charge for residential. So low is single semi-detached, medium is townhouses, high density is apartments. And then we also calculate a non-residential charge, which is represented on a cost per square foot. The next slide. So in very simple terms, we have costs which look into the future to service new growth, divided by growth. And that's how we come up with the calculation of the development charges. Next slide. I talked about the local service policy a little bit, and why we've highlighted it is because there has been some refinements to the legislation, which was in 2013. And it basically identified that the Act would prohibit municipalities from imposing additional payments or requiring the developers to construct a service that's not authorized under the development charge. So basically that says that we need to then turn our minds to expressing clearly within the policy what are the responsibilities of the developing landowner, what are they going to construct as their full costs, and then draw a line and say past that line, these are the items that we would include in the development charge. So as I say, we've included a detailed policy. That's Appendix E. And I invite counselors or the public to take a look at that. So we've met that requirement within the Act once again. Next slide. There are a number of exemptions. Historically, the first three big bullets were in the legislation since 1997, and the fourth large bullet is what they've just added in over the last month. So initially, there's an exemption for industrial expansions. So if I have a 100,000 square foot building, I can expand it by 50%, 50,000 square feet, and not have to pay the development charge. If I expanded more than that, then that increment that's past the 50% would be chargeable for the DC. There's a local government exemption, so you can't impose your charge on the county or on the school boards. The school boards build a new school, you can impose your charges, but your school board does have charges as well, and they wouldn't be able to impose it on you or the county. So it's kind of a quid pro quo exemption. The last one, the third large item, just talks that you are allowed, if you have an existing single family home, you can add up to apartments in that single family home as long as you don't more than double the size. And in doing so, you don't have to pay a development charge. If you're medium density, so a townhouse, and you add a townhouse or a row house complex, you can add one additional unit, and the same thing with the apartments. You can add one additional unit and not have to pay the charge. Now, the last bullet is something that's brand new and within new units. So if I come forward to the town with a building permit for a single family home, I can add an additional apartment as part of my building permit application, and that additional apartment will not be imposed a charge. So if I have my single family home, but I want to put an ancillary unit, maybe I have a detached garage, or maybe I want to put a granny flat on the property, then the change of the legislation says now that I can do that, and you cannot impose a charge on me. So it's one of these areas where when you do these type of exemptions, you lose revenue, and these are mandated by the province. Now, the next slide just talks about your ability to create discretionary exemptions. So you as council may wish to exempt certain categories of development or certain types of development. So a category would be industrial, a type may be a place of worship. So you can create that exemption within your bylaw. If the charge is going up considerably, you may wish to consider phasing it in over time. And then the third bullet identifies that development you could replace what was there and not have to pay a charge. So my house burns down, I can replace it within, say, 5 years. If I knock down a hall and decide to replace it with something larger, maybe a commercial building, I would get a credit for the amount of square footage that was there before. Currently, you have exemptions for non-residential development, and you have exemptions for certain sort of apartment development. So these are in place and for development agreements that are executed up until June 2022. So we've continued those within the bylaw. Next slide. There's a requirement as well to consider area specific charges. We normally don't recommend area specific charges unless they relate to services such as water and wastewater and perhaps storm. The reason for that is there are some anomalies in the legislation that if you move towards area rating for, say, parks or recreation, you will end up not being able to fully fund those units. And that means that, that particular infrastructure, and it means that the cost would end up being placed onto the existing residents. But if you impose those charges off on a broader perspective, you would probably be able to fully fund those infrastructures. So we have provided for development, for where the services are provided. I think your water is provided throughout the municipality, but wastewater is not completely. That would be considered an area specific. But we've also provided for a very specific wastewater servicing area specific charge. And I'll touch upon that as we get closer to the end. Next slide. As I've noted, there's been changes in the legislation. The Bill 71, which was the smart growth for our communities in 2015, made a number of changes, not significant. I'll go over them in a moment. And then over the last year and a half, we've gone through Bill 108, which was More Homes, More Choice Act. You'll recall that's the one that modified 15 or 16 different pieces of legislation all at once. There was refinements to that through Bill 138, and then we have Bill 197, which imposed most of the new conditions. So if I touch on these briefly, next slide, please. Bill 73 did some minor adjustments to definitions of ineligible services and definitions. They require you to turn your mind to area-specific DCs, as I noted a couple of slides back. Historically, solid waste was completely an ineligible service, but they brought back waste diversion. So recycle, reuse, organics are now eligible, but you can't do landfill or incineration. There's a requirement to touch upon asset management, basically requiring to turn our minds to asset management. That's provided for in Appendix F, so we've met that requirement. You can provide for transit, but they've modified the way that we calculate transit needs. Actually, it's more of an area that potentially requires a little bit of engineering assistance to do that now. The no additional levies we talked about, that's a local service policy. The public process has been extended, minimum 60 days. We touched upon that. And then there have been changes to how the treasurer reports the charges, and basically some refinements to be more transparent in the information that you provide. So not a huge impact per se on municipalities, but they are changes regardless. Next slide, please. So I've really touched upon here the impacts. Next slide. More Homes, More Choice Act. Basically, they initially tried to implement a very large number of changes to the legislation, which at the end of the day got watered down quite considerably. So the impacts aren't as dire as what we initially expected. And they ended up splitting it into two pieces of legislation, what they implemented through Bill 108 and then further through that Bill 197. So in effect, what Bill 108 introduced was some cash flow issues or things which would help out certain types of development. So if you are constructing rental housing or institutional developments, the Act says that you can pay over 6 equal payments. So the first 1/6 of your charge is at the day you take out the building permit, and then you can pay on the anniversary the rest of the payments over the next 5 years. Nonprofit housing, similar to that, but they can pay over 21 payments, so roughly over 20 years. For developments that are coming through site plans, so I come in with a site plan application or a zoning bylaw amendment application, The rate is frozen as of the day I come in for the application. Now, the rate is frozen until such time that you approve that application. And then from that date, we have another 2 years in order to commence that development. And if you commence, then the rates are basically frozen. If you pass that date, then the new charge is in effect. Now, I would mention that the rental housing, institutional development, nonprofit, and even the site plan zoning bylaw freezing of the charges, you can impose interest. So you can index them so that to some extent those charges will rise over the period of time. Or you can, and maybe based on that indexing, some of the developments may opt to pay the charges at the time of, say, the building permit. But you can pay for, or you can impose additional interest costs on those staged payments. Next slide. So as I say, Bill 197 is the one where we see the largest change, and we've noted some of them. They've reduced the number of eligible services down to the 20 that I presented. Before, the Act said you could impose for any service you're provided, or except for the ones we tell you can't. So there was things such as hospital grants, parkland acquisition, the headquarters for general administration in the municipality. Those were just the items where we couldn't do it. Now they've basically broadened the number of exempted services. I think it would probably impact more at the county level than at your level, but still they've made significant changes. There's a refinement in what we call classes of service. For the most part, it just means the way we do the calculations change a little bit. I don't think it's significantly impacting the amounts that you can recover, but it's something that we have to deal with from a technical or legal perspective. We used to do a mandatory 10% reduction for the softer services, and I noted this earlier. They've removed that, so now you don't have to make a contribution towards certain of those capital items. So they basically expanded by 10 or 11% your recovery for those softer services. They've also said historically those softer services, we were limited to a 10-year planning horizon. They've now broadened it, say you can measure it over any period of time. For the most part, those softer services, we stayed on the 10-year time plane, given that we were significantly invested in the process by the time the province made changes. Next slide. There are changes on community benefit charges. I won't spend a lot of time, but if you have developments that are 5 stories or larger, and you have a minimum of 10 units, you can develop a charge which would be no larger than 4% of the cost of the land that's underneath that building. So the day before building permit, you could do a market value appraisal and charge that development 4%, up to 4%. They got to go through, develop a strategy, go through a public process, etc. But it's something that's an extra tool to see if these high density developments need some additional specialized services. Next slide. So I spent most of the process or the presentation so far giving you the legislative background and the approach, and now I'll get into basically the calculation of the charge for you. One thing that I know that councils always need to consider as we go through the process is the fact that as growth occurs, the growth will initiate the need for infrastructure to be constructed. So if you're going into new areas, extending water mains, sewers, building additional roads or intersections or street lights, etc. So these costs are can be identified directly to new growth. It is not mandatory to have the development charge bylaw, but if you don't charge it, those are still costs that have to be paid for. So you end up paying for them through property taxes or water and sewer rates or reserves. Alternatively, you can seek to impose a charge. That way you're collecting the money from the development, which is giving rise to that additional infrastructure needs. So this is always between council's consideration. You have to balance your policies against growth and against the impact potentially on existing taxpayers. Next slide. The growth forecast is based on, or at least the residential forecast is considering over the next number of years, growth that's in the range about 250 to 300 units per year. You can see that historically, your building activity was roughly around 220, 225 units per year. So that's that red line looking at historic growth. And projection forward is to be marginally higher than that, giving rise to a blend of low, medium, and high density units. You can see the dark gray is the singles and semi-detached. Light gray is in the middle there is the townhouses, and then the apartments are presented in the orange color. Next slide. And basically, if you take a look over 10 years, about 2,600 units, or translating into about 6,100 people. Going out to 2039, we're just under 6,000 units, and that would give rise to about 13,000 people. We've also given you the square footage of non-residential space, which we would anticipate over those time horizons. Next slide. Your current charges right now, just under $16,000 for a single detached unit. And you can see that the largest components are roads, which are about $6,200, your wastewater systems, $3,600, and recreation and culture around $3,100. And you can see as we move across the table there, the largest units are single and semi-detached. Medium density or multiples are somewhat lower. So they're about 66% of that charge. And then we get into apartments, which are another reduction of about $1,500. You also have these special care units, which for the most part are to address things like seniors housing or retirement homes, etc. The non-residential charge is $5 per square foot, and that's only for the water and the wastewater. Next slide. The services we provided, you can see here, most of the services are town-wide, but wastewater, there's two categories of wastewater, one which is the broader, larger infrastructure, the trunk mains and such. And then there's a special charge for the Rome sanitary service area. Next slide, Daryl, please. And then the charges that we've calculated are basically for the town-wide, so the municipal-wide services. So basically everything except for wastewater is about $17,000. The urban area outside the Rome area would be $2,100, and if you are within that sanitary sewers area, it'd be just under $22,000 for a single detached unit. You can see similarly, if we go to the medium density, which are other multiples, we drop down the amount of the charge, and then we have split the apartments into two different categories, basically large apartments versus small apartments. So we've given rise to a large apartment charge of about $9,100 and about $7,600 for the small. The calculated charges we have right now, and you must consider non-residential as part of you must at least calculate it. Doesn't mean that council is required to implement it. But we've, for your consideration, have calculated the charges for all the different components of the services that you're providing. Next slide. This is just basically summarizing what I just went through. We have separated the the apartment units into 2 different sizes, and we've looked at other multiples and defined that as basically your townhouses, your row houses, and duplexes. So it's just a refinement we've made to the definitions within the within your bylaw. Next slide. And this basically shows you to the north or to the top of the graph, basically the area where the wastewater charges would be imposed. In the lower half, the wastewater charge would not be imposed. So we wanted to highlight that for you. And then the next slide demonstrates the Riom sanitary service area. So within this area, there's a specialized additional charge for development, which will occur within this blue area. Next slide. So just to compare the charges between what you have today and what we've calculated, you can see the town-wide services going from about $12,000 to just over $17,000. The wastewater service charge is actually dropping a bit from $3,600 to $2,100. And then we have that special area-specific charge of about $2,200 for single detached. Next slide. The non-residential charge, we presented very similar perspective. So the water, the rate now is 69 cents. It would go up to $1.28. But you can see this, we calculated other services. Wastewater would actually drop from about over $4 to just above $1. And then we don't anticipate that drive area to have non-residential development. Next slide. This is just comparing the charges to basically your neighbors throughout the county. You can see that the light blue is where your current charge is, light blue arrow. The green is the calculated charge that we've undertaken, and then the red includes that area-specific charge. So you can see for the most part, you're in and around the middle of the pack for your charges. You can see that right now your lakeshore is a little bit higher than you. They're looking at we just had a public meeting a couple of days ago. Their calculated charge is actually increasing, and you can see it's just to the left of the arrow. Next slide. Looking at your commercial charges, you can see once again you're in the middle of the neighboring municipalities. You're actually a little bit lower, but the calculated charges would basically put you in and about the middle of the pack. On the next slide, if we considered industrial, which is currently exempt, you would see that there are some municipalities that exempt industrial, but there's others that impose the full charge. Next slide. So that completes my presentation through you, Chair. Happy to answer any questions. As Daryl probably explained, tonight is only to present the information to the public, receive any questions of council or the public, and then consideration of the bylaw would not come until early December. So I've completed my presentation. Happy to answer any questions that council or the public may have.
Thank you, Mr. Scanlon and Daryl. Members of council, any questions? Mr. Reno.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a couple questions from the presentation and the way we do things here. 2 years ago, we added transit. And what I'm wondering is, I don't recall, did we do a DC amendment at the time, or is this something we're just adding now? I'm just wondering for future, if we add some new feature before the next DC comes around, if we should be doing an amendment to start collecting money, for example, in the last 2 years.
through the chair, if you have changes in services, you can amend the bylaw at any time. So to do it, you need not quite as thick a document as what we've prepared, but you do have to have a background study. And we could undertake the calculation, and then you need the 2 months to go through the public process, and you can amend the bylaw to introduce a new service.
Thank you. And one supplemental. Why does wastewater drop? What has changed? It seems like everything costs more moving in the future. Why does wastewater drop?
The servicing needs, through the chair, the servicing needs are limited to basically some trunk services that we need to construct in order to facilitate the growth. And we've looked going out to basically 2039. So the capacity of that infrastructure should be adequate to service the growth out to that period. So it's basically reduction in the cost and to some extent an expansion in the amount of growth. And that's what's causing the charge to reduce in that particular area.
And if I could, one final question based on that response. Considering we're paying off a long-term debt for water, was that something that was considered as it's still costing us money moving forward?
Yes, debt charges for growth can be included into the calculations, and we have done that.
Thank you. I appreciate your answers.
Good questions, Jeff. No other questions from council members? Mr. Akpata.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you, I just would like some clarification on exemptions. You spoke about churches and other things that we can exempt. Depending on what the future of the municipality is, we may not know what is coming down the pipe for our community. How would you recommend we start to be forward-looking to determine if we needed a future exemption? And then I use an example. Industry, greenhouses, things of that nature that aren't a core component of the town of LaSalle. Do we have to go through the process again with the public meeting and things of that nature? I just want to make sure that I understand that for future reference, sir.
Through the chair, the exemptions are normally expressed within your bylaw, so that the building official, here comes an application, they look at the bylaw and it gives that individual guidance on whether to charge or not, and then how much to charge. There are many municipalities exempt bona fide farms, but some of them don't exempt greenhouses because they can be considerable, or they may impose only for water and wastewater. Obviously, they consume a significant amount of water, and as a result, some municipalities choose to, even though they exempt a ma and pa, so to speak, farm, they would charge a greenhouse. So Leamington, when they had their bylaw before, they imposed charges on greenhouses. They had removed their bylaw, but I understand, well, they're looking to potentially reconsider a bylaw into the future. You've got a place like Chatham-Kent to basically charge both for water and for wastewater as part of their charges. So once again, it's they initiate services, and then it's to the municipality to decide whether they're exempt or not. But you can modify your exemptions at any time, but you do have to go through a bit of a process.
Thank you very much, sir. Quite clear answer to that question. Thank you, Your Worship. That's it.
Thank you, Mike. Mr. Carrick.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a kind of how the charges is formulated in the result of, we can't just arbitrarily throw in numbers that we want to raise to put more money away. Like say for police, if we want to double that kind of number, or fire, double that kind of number for future investment, etc. uses. Is this about what growth is, what's expected growth, or can we kind of massage the numbers a little bit, or is this about where we need to be, or is that actually how it works for the bylaw? Or DC charge, sorry.
Through the chair, I think I mentioned that as part of the calculations we do, and this is Appendix B, we have to look backwards 10 years, and there's a calculation we do which sets an upper ceiling into the future. And that ceiling we can't go past. So, but to answer your question, if we, let's say for fire, could through that calculation charge for $5 million worth of infrastructure, but in going through the process with staff, we only identified $3 million, then there's still some room where if council wished to enhance that contribution, we could consider that. So there are certain instances where we can increase it. There's others where we've maxed out on the calculations.
Okay, because we have, I won't mention it now, but there could be some situations popping up where there might be access to a need of more money. So you said there's a little bit of room to kind of maneuver a bit in and up, is what you're basically saying.
Certainly. I mean, if outside of tonight, if you want to pose a question to, where are those services where we might be able to enhance the service a little bit, I'd be happy to give you a perspective on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was a good question. Okay, doesn't seem like there's any other questions. So we have a recommendation that the report of the Director of Finance, Director of Development and Strategic Initiatives, and Director of Public Works dated October 19th, 2020, regarding development charges background study be received for information. Moved by Deputy Mayor Meloche, seconded by Councillor Reno. All in favor? That carries unanimously. Mr. Scanlon and Daryl, thank you for your presentation. It's very detailed. If we'll look into what Mr. Carrick brought up, and we'll see if there's any room that we should or not increase. But as of now, we'll carry it forward the way it is and see where we go. Thanks for your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you as well. Good night.
So we need a conformatory bylaw, 3 readings. On the first reading, we have Councillor Carrick and Deputy Mayor Meloche. All in favor? That carries. Thank you. Second reading, Councillor Dicho Spagnolo and Councillor Desjardins. All in favor? That carries. Third and final reading, Councillor Reno and Councillor Akpata. All in favor? That carries. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, administration. I know it was a lot of hard work that was involved with Mr. Solani, Mr. Mara, Mr. Langos. I can't forget Tano, and of course, Mr. Militia. So thanks everybody for your contribution, and we'll see you soon. Have a good night.